Hi, Connor Hastings, I think, as far as I know. So this talk is really confusing sounding. I think I was really into buzzwords and I had a word of the day calendar when I submitted a CFP. And colocate seemed like a cool word that would stand out. What does that mean? Basically, it's about how can we use the power of GraphQL and specifically the query system if we don't necessarily have access to all of GraphQL. We don't necessarily have access to setting up a GraphQL server. We don't control the backend, but we still really find power in the query system and writing UIs where the data is explicitly defined alongside a component, and doing that in such a way that if we ever make a GraphQL migration, we don't just throw away all this code. So GraphQL is actually a specification. It has design principles that it's based on, and I read them a couple times. So I understood 3 out of 5 of them, so I think I'm pretty much an expert. Yeah, so I'll go through that. I'll go through what's inherently appealing about GraphQL, at least to me. Different things appeal to different people. Can I just use parts of GraphQL and not the whole thing? And specifically, can I just use the query system in my UI? So once again, I'm Connor Hastings. I'm a UI engineer at Netflix. I work on studio products, which is stuff you don't see, which is cool because I only have to support the latest Chrome. I'm on Twitter at StillConnor, and the other stuff, physical world, if it exists, I'm here. There's no stage, but we can pretend there's one. There's a lectern. How do I know this talk is going to go well? It's a good question. I checked my horoscope this morning. Trouble with work, thinking, creativity, spirituality, social life, and self. So, at least it's not this. So, I feel pretty good. But yeah, GraphQL design principles, what are they? Number 1, hierarchical. This means that the structure of the query is in such a way that you see the data. The way you structure the data in the query is the same way that you will receive that data object. You will always have that data in that format. If that data is not available, it will be nulled, not undefined. So it will JSON parse will go across the wire, and it will stay in that shape, which is very important. Product-centric, which I think is something a lot of people don't think about when they're writing code, especially if you're not making a product. Code that this is explicitly designed with the UI in mind and working from a UI, whether that's a phone or a web app or a desktop app, designed with the UI in mind, saying, let's make it as easy as possible for the UI to design components that are bug-free, and then the backend will go from there. Strong typing is a key part of GraphQL. This enables a lot of things. So you have things like the basic types like strings and numbers, and then you have scalar types. You can write your own types. So strong typing makes doing things like TypeScript integration and stuff relatively simple and just gives you more safety guarantees over your API. Client-specified queries. This is very similar to hierarchical to me. The client is the one, we're kind of turning the traditional model on its head. The client is saying what it wants, and then the backend will deal with it. Obviously, someone's going to have to write the backend or some middle layer, but the client says what it wants, and it gets it in that exact shape. So if I like to equate this to a traditional REST API might be like ordering a pizza, and you get every topping that they offer. So you get 40 toppings on your pizza no matter what. You're always going to get all the data because that's just how it works. You hit get/person, you get the whole person, or get/pizza, you get the whole pizza, 40 toppings, and then you have to pick off every topping that you don't want, and you're like, these are actually the only 4 toppings I want on my pizza, but you get the whole thing. That could cause a longer request over the wire. Sometimes it feels like you're waiting your whole life for the data to come back. It's me aging last night. Yeah, so it's very nice because you only get what you want and you can see what you want. So the next person can see what you wanted, which is very important because most products are made not just by one person for one person. They're made by many people for many people, so someone else is going to have to work on that code, and being explicit is usually better than being implicit. And the last one, this is one I understand the least, but I kind of understand it now. It's introspective, meaning that since it is typed, you can actually query a GraphQL schema using GraphQL. So this allows you to write a lot of tooling around it. Pretty sure it enables what I'm going to talk about. So you can query something and say, what kind of types does person have? So what's appealing about GraphQL? Like I've said earlier, and I will say probably 1,000 times in this talk, the query system is extremely powerful. Structuring a query is relatively straightforward, and you can use GraphQL files so you can share between, since it's a schema definition language and just a specification, you can share GraphQL across multiple programming languages, across different parts of your app. So front end and back end can use an app. If you have a Node app or not a Node app, it can still use it because GraphQL is GraphQL. Less data sent over the wire, theoretically. If you don't need all the data, you're not going to send all that data over the wire using a server. So especially on mobile, this is important. I think Lee Byron says that the initial thought for GraphQL came from Facebook mobile app, and especially when they started moving worldwide, you have a lot of high latency internet environments, and less data you send over the wire, the better, because only take what you need. And reducing round trips to the server, again, this matters a lot in a high latency environment. So a lot of us are used to like very high speed internet, so it really doesn't matter if the app makes 40 requests. But in other places, it's not necessarily like that. So making one request might be better. It enables developer tooling. That's kind of the introspective thing. So you can have something like graphical, which allows you to kind of just pop into a UI, test out a GraphQL query against your API, and then just see what the result will look like. And that's without having to write any part of an app except the GraphQL part. So you can do a lot of prototyping of your queries in there, see what kind of think about what queries you're going to need, and then you're kind of thinking about the app more ahead of time. And probably a lot of other things too. So you can come and tell me, because I didn't invent GraphQL, and I don't know everything. That would be crazy. So what if I don't need to solve all these problems? So I listed a lot of problems there. Less data over the wire, the problem, round trips, client queries, typing, introspection. These are things that are great, like all of them are great, and they're all great in certain scenarios, and sometimes they're all great in every scenario, but sometimes you don't need to solve them all. So I work on an app that serves like 20 people, and they're all in a Netflix office. So sending less data over the wire is not important, and my boss will tell me that for sure. So there's a strong business case for less data over the wire. If you're doing something like internal tools where you're supporting only Chrome and everyone works in an office, you really don't need to care about this all that much, because the speed is going to be negligible. Speed difference will be negligible. My application is short-lived, and it's not worth devoting the resources and time to creating a full GraphQL API. So that is something you have to do, versus it's less ad hoc, I would say, than spinning up another API where you're just creating like some RPC endpoints, grabbing data, prototyping. You have to kind of think through creating a schema. That's me again, moving a clock slowly. I only try to use GIFs of myself so I don't infringe on anyone's IP. My application is new and the data is changing a lot, so that's when I'll often experiment with using just parts of GraphQL when I don't necessarily want to write the schema, because I don't know what the schema is going to end up being, and I want to prototype some components in different ways. And I don't control the backend data source, so if you're using something like Firebase and you don't have any node middle tier or anything, you can kind of just say, like, maybe I just want to use a query system and query my Firebase database, but I don't control anything else. So yeah, to me, it's all about the query system. To other people, it's all about everything else. But I'm the one speaking, so I can say it's all about the query system. I'm sure we've all felt like this at work sometimes. If you work on a front-end UI app and like you separate your front-end and back-end teams, that's me falling at work off a couch. So yeah, sometimes it feels like the back-end is actually working at odds with the front end of an application, where the data is structured in such a way that you're doing all this massaging of data on the front end, and then by the time it gets to the component, it's gone through like all these processing functions, and you have to like unprocess it to send it back to the server, and you're just like, I have no idea what's going on. Please help me. I keep falling over and over again in a loop. And they're probably doing it for a smart reason that I don't know, because I mean, we're not the only ones talking to that API often. Other backend services will be talking to it, and it will be for them. But when you're making a UI, you kind of want things to be nice for the UI. And so I remember this term from the 1990s, early 2000s, what you see is what you get. This isn't me. I'm not Macromedia Dreamweaver 8, but that's the most famous WYSIWYG I remember. And yeah, but GraphQL actually does that for data. GraphQL takes what we used to do for making web pages and it was really cool to just spin up a web page. Like, definitely how I got into the internet, the fact that I could just like drag stuff around and then something happened. And GraphQL kind of brings that to data, which is, I think, going to open up new possibilities for people entering this sphere, where it's like not as opaque. So you get declarative data fetching, which is, again, you say, I want this. I want the person, and I want his name, or her name, or their name, and I want where they were born. You don't care about their birthday or any of the other data that is stored about them. You just want those two things, and you say you want those two things, and you get those two things. So I imagine coming into the first day of a new job, and it's a Redux app, and you might see something like this. This is pretty bad Redux, so I use Redux. No offense meant to any Reduxers. But you might see something like this, and it's very opaque, but not super opaque. It's getting, you can tell it's getting a user and getting settings, right? So that's a step up from where we've been at previous times, but you still don't know what is get user returning, what is get settings returning. With GraphQL, you might see something like this. You might see a query. It's saying, give me the user, and I want their ID, their name, their created date. Give me the settings, column with theme, and the first day someone might do row heights or something. Row height might be a setting that's saved, right? So if there might be a Jira ticket that says, add in the row height to this thing, and in the left side example, if it's on your left, I don't really know, it's on my left. So the Redux one, like you'd have to go through some functions, figure out where it's getting the settings, where that's connected to the component, and then how exactly that setting is stored. With GraphQL, you might be doing more upfront work to set up the schema, but once you actually get to use it, you have very nice things like this where you're getting exactly what you want, and you're declaring exactly what you want. You can just see it, and I think it's like a gift to the world, just like me. So can we just use the query system? This is something I thought about a lot, and I thought about how funny it would be if I just stopped the talk here and said, no, we can't. You have to use all of GraphQL, and that's it. And then I just walked out and went home, but that would be rude, and I'm not going to do that. So the answer is kind of, we can just use the query system, yes, but you lose a lot of stuff. You do lose some stuff from GraphQL. You lose things like strong typing and introspection. Strong typing can be brought back in some ways, where I'm doing some experimentation with TypeScript, but most of the backend focused portion of GraphQL, you lose from just using the query system, because a string that says column width has no idea that it's a number. So once again, so you maintain hierarchical, you maintain product-centric, you're still focusing on your product and just getting data into your product. Strong typing, you kind of lose. Client-specified queries, still have. And introspectiveness, you obviously lose because there's no more schema, and you can't introspect on something that doesn't exist. At least that's what my mom told me. So she said, stop thinking so much. You still get the query system, easy to shape its component to meet the needs of data to meet the needs of a component. You are still sending as much data over the wire, because at the end of the day, you're still going to have to make requests that are the same as the requests that were being made before. It's just abstracted a little bit. You're probably not going to reduce round trips either. You can do optimizations around this, around batching requests, which you wouldn't necessarily do, or you'd have to write by hand, and you could do optimizations around that, but it's still going to make the same number of requests so you get the same data because you're still hitting the same endpoints. And you lose a lot of the developer tooling things like GraphQL, which kind of sucks. But how? GraphQL, or however you want. But this is what I'll talk about. So this is a library I've been working on that basically uses GraphQL.js, but just a parser to take, and it takes paradigms from Apollo and other tools and essentially allows you to use the GraphQL query system without actually having to have a GraphQL backend. Someone told me I should have called it HalfQL, and I was like, wow, that's way better. But I already wrote the slide, and I like my slides to be immutable. So if it's not a valid GraphQL query, it will not be a valid GraphQL query. This was really important to me because I want to be able to use the existing tooling from the community and from GraphQL. So it uses the GraphQL parser internally. That's just from the GraphQL.js library, or you could use GQL from Apollo, or anything that's going to produce a GraphQL AST or not. You could pass in a string or an AST, but it still has to be a valid GraphQL query according to the GraphQL spec, which you probably want because you wouldn't want to probably stay on something like this forever. You'd kind of want to maybe use this to test out GraphQL, test out the query system. So I think the easiest way to do this is just to take a look at code. So if you look, this is from Apollo, and it's getting a post, and it's getting the title of that post. You can see it's passing in variables, ID1. Theoretically, that could be a function, and the variable could come from props, but here it's not. And then it's just showing the title. And then GraphQL, which is the library we'll talk about, you'll see it's very similar. The difference are it has now request data for fields, and it's actually giving, it's returning this params argument, which is essentially the REST route it will construct, or any route it will construct, but it's just using props to do that, and then showing data title. But if you look here, and I could give this a name, and it would work the same. It's relatively similar. We have a few differences that we could probably work out over time, but if you look at the main parts, it's relatively similar. So how does this work? I could just be a magician using smoke and mirrors, which if anyone knows what smoke and mirrors is, please tell me, because I want to know how magicians use it. Because people say it all the time, and I'm like, okay, I've used a mirror and I've seen smoke, so I've done magic. So, yes. So yeah, it checks if it's a string. If it's a string, it parses it using the GraphQL parser. Otherwise, it just uses a query. It assumes you're passing an AST and will fail miserably if you've passed in something else. And then we see that we take the so GraphQL AST will return selections. These are essentially the fields you are requesting. And we'll take that and it maps over the selection set. And essentially, if it says the word query, it assumes that it is a query. So we'll do a GET request by default, although all these things are overridable. And then otherwise, we'll do a POST request, so we'll assume mutation if it's not a query. So, but overridable again. And then it has params, which would be route parameters, query params, and a body. And then it has this get default request data, which is essentially if your REST API is returning data in a way that you're structuring the query, and you just want to use it so you can co-locate the query and kind of pick the data out, then just use the default will work fine. Otherwise, you'll have to do some custom resolving on the front end. And essentially after that, all it does is loop over. It uses a library called fetch-to-dupe, which is a thin wrapper on fetch that gives you the same caching policies that come with React Apollo. So you have like network first, cache only. So you get things like that, and that allows you to basically, the end goal is be allowing you to switch to GraphQL when you actually can and do stuff iteratively. And so it will And so then you'll get your data. Your data will be cached for free on the UI. Just like Apollo, I believe the default option is cache first. So this just uses the same thing, cache first. So it'll look for data in the cache. Otherwise, it will go to the network. And you can override that on a prop basis or however. And then to get the response, it will see if that specific field has a resolver written for it. You'll write a resolver on the front end instead of on a backend schema here, which I have blog posts that goes into more detail, so you can see that. But essentially, it's just getting the data. With an array, it maps over it and picks out what you want. Otherwise, it just picks out what you want. So you can also use it as a higher order component. Basically, I've just copied Apollo and changed the names of things and written different code. So this is an example of using an HOC, and you see on the left-hand side that it is getting data. It says Connor, cool guy, so you know I'm cool. I write blog posts about stuff that cool people do. And the to-do list, I don't actually ever make to-do lists, so I didn't know what to put in it for fake data. So they're all the same because I don't really like to look at lists. And then, yeah, here's the same exact thing with the render prop component. So this is the, I think, the hooks will now be the more blessed way. I did not have time to make a hook demo, but render props is kind of how you'll see all the documentation in Apollo now. So that's how I've written it here. And here, the same thing, but a mutation. So it's actually hitting this data. It's using, you see an override method here because it's actually doing a put, and it's incrementing a count and by one. So it's using an argument. And you see mutation count value, and then this will return the new value. Here's the same thing as a render prop. So query deferral is something that Apollo has implemented, where you essentially tag a field with @defer, and it will essentially defer the loading of that selection. So it will get your less expensive data first, and then get your expensive data. So I've done the same thing. So here you see it waits for everything, and then eventually it will show you data. And here you see data appears immediately, but there's no to-do list. To-dos, I guess, will be here soon. And you see that this is a really powerful paradigm that doing, like when you're handwriting fetch requests to like a REST endpoint, it's something that's not exactly, it's not necessarily difficult, but it's just like ugly and you're writing weird abstractions. So whereas in GraphQL, this is GraphQL schema things, I forget what they're called. It's actually part of the GraphQL spec to write these things and to defer with implemented by the Apollo team. And so this is just for free as part of GraphQL. Uses the same syntax as Apollo, so just to-dos, defer. And so that means load the other data first, then get to-dos. But all your to-dos will be the same, so who cares? So it's GraphQL compliant, I say. Does that mean it works with GraphQL tooling outside of the generic stuff like the GraphQL parser? So there's this really cool tool or Babel plugin called Babel Blade that essentially allows you, it actually abstracts the writing of GraphQL queries to kind of what I believe to be the ultimate end goal of UI, to just write components that use data. And so you might have the person component that uses name and birthday, and you just write the component and you write data.person.name, data.person.birthday, and then the GraphQL query is constructed for you. It gets that data, and all you've done is write a UI component. The less code we write, and the more that we can give to the machines, the better off our apps will be, because people make mistakes more than machines do, I think. I don't know if that's actually been proven. Probably, though. So this is actually an example using Babel Blade. Here you would import the Babel Blade plugin macro, or just the plugin, and you see it has person query, which then you call this function create query, which comes from, again, Babel Blade, which will use the Babel plugin. And then you see, if you see here, I just say const data equals person query data, data is the return from the child function from RouteQL, and then I call data.person.person_name, data.person.type, and that data just comes to me. That query is generated, passed in to the query argument, and I've not even written a query now. So this is using tooling that was written specifically for GraphQL using Babel, and you're able to use an entirely different library and still get the same benefits. So Babel Blade is actually written by someone that's here and speaking today, Sean. He's speaking about immutable and immer after lunch today. So you should definitely go to his talk, because anyone that could do something like that will probably give a better talk than this, so definitely go to that. So usage in a real-world app. Has it ever been used in the wild? No. Why would anyone do that? This is just me at my house late at night. But I've used it in an app that I use, so that exists in the real world, so it kind of has been. So if anyone has seen the movie Clueless, Cher has a pretty sweet closet for picking out outfits. And I'm like, that's all. Every time I watch the movie, I just get jealous that she has this. And she had this in 1995. It does machine learning, I think, because it can match outfits. It was insane software for 1995. And it's insane that a person just had this development team. I'm not that good as whoever she hired, but I was able to use GraphQL with React Native and make a similar-ish app for picking out clothes. These are pictures of my actual clothes, and it's just a React Native app using GraphQL to make all the requests, and it just uses Firebase as a backend, and there's nothing else. There's nothing in between. But again, yeah, if they're still out there, someone should hire them, because they were doing crazy stuff in 1995. And then I'd just like to give a shout out to other tools that exist that are like this. GraphQL Anywhere is kind of even more free than this, I would say. GraphQL, you essentially pass in a GraphQL query and a resolver, and it could be anything. It doesn't have to be, it's not necessarily even related to a network. If you have like a very RESTful API and it really stays on REST paradigms, Apollo Link REST and Apollo work tremendously well for if translating from a REST to GraphQL system iteratively, which I think is the goal of a lot of organizations. Like, GraphQL's not been around all that long, and most apps aren't brand new, so you can't really just switch all your APIs and your apps. No one's going to rewrite all their apps in a second. So things that allow us to do things iteratively actually allow us to use new tools. And probably other things, again, please tell me. I don't know that much stuff. So just to recap, you can query and mutate arbitrary backends, poll for new data with poll interval argument, caching very similar to Apollo, and probably other stuff that I wrote and forgot. Because if I write it after midnight, I don't remember that it's in the library. And then top-level deferred queries, which I think is one of the more interesting things, because I think query directives are a very powerful thing that in GraphQL that people are just trying to use, query and schema directives, which essentially allow you to extend it's a language extension that anyone can write and implement. So imagine it as writing like a Babel plugin or something for JavaScript, but for GraphQL, and it's actually supported by the spec of GraphQL. So what's coming? Nested selection sets right now are not supported. Just moving to arguments like the Apollo example, so you're more in line kind of with the rest of the community. And then automated migration path to Apollo, because I think the end goal for everyone should be to be on actual GraphQL, and either that I can make that, the happier I'll be. And then optimistic updates, which I think I might have already done, and direct access to cache, which also already exists. GraphQL, so yeah, and then finally, just to recap, I really believe that GraphQL has introduced a new and very powerful paradigm for front ends to talk to back ends. And I think the query system is really where everyone can begin to see value. Like typing, you see value over time. Introspection, you see value over time. But a hierarchical query that actually matches the data and the component structure of your application, you can kind of see power in immediately. And you can imagine a world in which you can actually create components from that data, like I kind of showed you with Sean's tool, which is just the coolest thing I've ever seen. So I think when someone sent it to me, I didn't believe in the internet for like 3 hours and thought the universe was fake. So yeah, just by making sacrifices and we give up some of the benefits of GraphQL, we can still leverage some of the power. That's it. Thank you so much for actually listening to me. Most of the time people don't, so here I am in the physical world. This is the GitHub library. There should be links to stuff probably. Yeah, that's it. If anyone has questions, I can answer them.